practice for solving a quadratic formula. So hopefully you have your notes from before, because that's what we're going to want to work through. And obviously it always starts off a little slower to begin with, and then you can speed up as you go along. But we have our first problem here of our given. So where we could say, well, we could factor it, but for this situation, we're just going to use it to practice our quadratic formula. So remember, the first step that you want to do is to choose to use the quadratic formula and to write it down. So let's do just that. First step, choose to use it and write the equation. What is the equation? Is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now obviously a lot of time you'll not see it with the parentheses, but this is a nice way to just avoid those negative constant pitfalls that often get people. So, step 2. Identify A, B, and C. So go ahead and do that now. And if you need to, remember this here. This is part of your standard equation. So given this, now mindful, this is an invisible 1 here. What does A equal? Write it down. What does B equal? Write it down. And what does C equal? So hopefully you got A equals 1, B equals 5, and C equals a negative 6. Okay. So let's move on to step number 3. What does it say? It says substitute in for the numbers and watch out for our negatives. And note, we do have a negative this time, so we want to make sure we do watch out for that. So take a moment, and I want you to rewrite this equation, but substitute in 1 for your A's, 5 for your B's, and negative 6 for your C. So go ahead and substitute that in now. And pause the video if you need more time. Okay. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of what would be the substitute of b squared minus 4 times my equivalent of a and c all over 2 times a. Step 4. We're going to start with our square, remembering that our numbers should always end up to be a positive number. So go ahead, what is 5 squared, or 5 times 5? Write it down. Hopefully you got 25. So step 5, we're going to multiply here. So everything else is just going to be rewritten. And so this minus, if you notice, I wrote that minus before I even looked at my multiplication. And that's what you want to do. You want to make sure you write that minus regardless of what your answer is here. So negative 6 times 1 is negative 6. Negative 6 times 4 would be negative 24. Hopefully that's what you got. Now if you notice, we have our negative situation. So that will eventually turn into a positive 24 in our next step. So this turns into a positive 24. And so I have 25 plus 24. That's why it's essential, because then it gives me 49. Now I come to check. Is there a negative? No, there's no negative, so I'm not going to have to worry about an I. Is it itself a perfect square, or is it divisible by a perfect square? And if so, simplify. And 49 is actually a perfect square. So if so, simplify. Okay. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that I'm going to be coming up with an example of down here. Okay. So our 7th one, we're going to break out my 5 here. Okay, and since this is a negative times a positive, I end up with a negative 5 here. Okay, and on my 8th step, I can basically look at simplifying and reducing here. But I have negative 5 plus or minus 7 all over 2. And since I have this example, we are going to break them into our 2 equations like I had last time. So you can do this a couple different ways. If you want, you can create equation number 1 here, or you can create number 1 down here. We'll just do it down below just for simplicity. Keep moving down. So number 1, my first equation, it doesn't matter if your first equation you decide to subtract the 7 or add the 7, it doesn't matter. So the negative 5 plus 7 over 2. And my second equation is going to be negative 5 minus 7 over 2. So if I went down 5 from 0 and then turn around and came back up 7, I'd take 5 to get back to 0, and then I'd be 2 more. So it's a positive 2 on the top divided by 2 on my bottom means I have an answer of 1. Down here, if I was to swim down 5 and then swim down 7 more feet, I'd be at a total of 7 to 10 is 3. 2 more would give me 12. Divided by 2 is negative 6. So x equals 1 or x equals negative 6. And so that would be my answer. I hope this helped. practice and another problem. So go ahead, copy this down. Remember, these are just my notes that I have that I took from Quadratic Formulas Solving for X Notes. And I've just folded them in half, so it's just kind of easier to see. That's up to your personal choice on that one. But so let's start going through our steps to solve. Step 1 is to make the choice to use the quadratic formula. So this one, if we were to try to factor it, starts getting a little bit more complicated. So we are going to make the choice of the quadratic formula. So the important part of writing it down is it just also helps kind of concrete it in your brain. It's a nice reference point, and is a highly recommended study skills whenever you're doing math, is to get those formulas written down so you have them and don't have to think about them. And so we have negative b plus or minus the square root, and remember, it's always here on your notes if you need it. A, C, all over 2A. Okay, boom. So next we are going to identify our A, B, and C. So this has that nice reference point that we can look at our equation and go, okay, we have A equals 2, B equals -5, C equals 3. Okay, step 3, substitute them in. And notice we have again another negative number. This time it is our B. That's a negative number. So we want to make sure we watch out for that when we go through to simplify. And so it's going to be -5. That's why the parentheses come in, that it's the opposite of B, even when B is negative. And here, it's going to be the -5 squared. So make sure when you go in, if you put it in your calculators by chance, make sure that negative is included inside the parentheses. So it's the square of -5 times -5, which should give us a positive number. A and C. Okay, so step 4, go ahead and do it. We're going to square the number. So write out your equation, square it, and start simplifying. So hopefully you have something that looks like this. Right? So step 5, next we're going to focus on these numbers here. Remember, it's a negative of whatever you get there. So go ahead and rewrite the equation, simplifying your interior. And again, I'm obviously doing this step by step. As you become more familiar with it, you can start combining steps together. You can start doing them all at the same time or in different orders. So remember, it's the negative of whatever our answer is. So we have 3 times 2, which is 6 times 4, which is 24, or 4 times 2, which is 8 times 3, which is also 24. So the same process is going to work over and over again. So what we're going to look at is when we simplify this, is there going to be a perfect square itself, or is there going to be a negative? And then see what we get inside there. So x equals 5 plus or minus the square root of 1. Now 1 actually is a perfect square. So I can simplify that down. And out here, remember we have a negative b minus a negative b. So this is going to become 5 plus or minus the square root of 1, which is 1 all over 4. So sometimes we'd be finished if we could simplify either way individually. We could do it that way. But since we have our classic process down here, and we have something that now looks like this, we're going to break it into our two separate equations. So go ahead, write equation number 1 and equation number 2 that you would make from this here. Pause the video if needed. So the equation you should get, and again it doesn't matter which one you do first, 5 plus 1 all over 4 and 5 minus 1 all over 4. So I get 6 divided by 4, which reduces down to 1 1/2. Remember, this can basically be the same thing as 4/4 plus 2/4. That's what my 6/4 can reduce down to. This is a unit fraction when it simplifies to 1, and 2/4 simplifies down to 1/2. And so here I'd get 4/4, it reduces to 1, so x could equal 1, or x could equal 1 1/2. Problem number 3. Go ahead and copy this down. And so if you notice, this equation's actually got a couple of things going on before we can actually start in our process to solve for x. And what that is that we need to get it into our standard formula, in our standard form. And so if you notice, we have an a, we have a b, but we're missing a c. And so if you refer back to our notes in terms of the setup of a quadratic equation, then basically what that means is that is 0. So c equals 0. And if you had something like this where there was a c, then we're going to do the same first step the exact same way, but you would just add it or subtract it to whatever that c happened to be. But in this case, it's 0. So in order to get it into this form, I'm going to use the well, in this case, actually, the addition property of equality and add 5 to both sides. So I actually end up with something that says 8x squared plus 6x. What? If you add 5 to both sides, what would this equation be? Plus 5 equals, and now I have my 0 over here. So there wasn't a c, I have to remember that means c equals 0, and 5 plus 0 is 5. Now again, if c actually had a value here, then I just add 5 to whatever that value happened to be, and just write that quantity here. So now that we have it in our standard form, we can now make the choice to use our quadratic formula and start our solving equation and process. So write the equation. Okay, and then step 2, identify my A, my B, and my C. Do so now. Okay, step 3, substitute them in to our equation. So pause the video and go ahead and substitute them in. And so you should get Alright, so step 4, go ahead and square this number. We're going to then multiply these numbers. So go ahead and do that now. Pause the video and check. This is 40 times 4, so 4 times 4 gives me 16, and have my 0 at the end. I'm going to simplify these. And I get negative 124. So I'm going to look at number 1. So obviously that means I'm going to have an I coming out, and then is it divisible by a perfect square? And so can 4 go into it? Yes, it can. Can 9 go into it? No. What about 16? What about 25? And basically at some point you get times 2, and 49 times 2, or 64 times 2, or anything like that. Times 2s or 3s usually the most common. But in this case we do have that 4 can go into it. So what could that look like? We'll do a little detour here. So I'm going to say this is the same thing as 4 times 31 times negative 1. So part of this step is being able to simplify this. And so we're going to show this step here. What happens when you have here? This is what you do. So I'm going to take the square root of 4, which becomes 2, the square root of -1, which becomes I, and the square root of 31, which stays within. Okay. So now I can move on to step 8. Please feel free to pause the video at any point. I've been going too quickly. So now we can only reduce numbers that are outside, or excuse me, simplify numbers that are outside of the radical. So we're talking the 6 and we're talking a 2. And both of those can be simplified with my 16. So what I'm kind of be looking at is basically -6/16 plus or minus 2/16 times I square root 31 over 1. Okay. Since this is multiplication, you'd multiply your numerators and multiply your denominators. And so that's how this can be rewritten as, this whole thing. And so let's simplify from here. So if I simplify, I get here, this reduces or simplifies down to what can go into both of these? 2 can. So 2 can go into 6 3 times. 2 go into 16 8 times. This can simplify down to 1/8 times I 31. And so what's going to happen is we're going to join this back together, and then since they have a like denominator, we're going to put them all back together over the same denominator. So I'm going to have a denominator of 8, because these combine. 8 times 1 is 8, and the common denominator of 8 stays 8. And my numerator becomes -3 plus or minus 1I, which is basically just I square root 31. Right? So these are excellent practice sets to have in your notes, as they kind of show you different situations and what to do in each of those situations, and you can use them as references between problem to problem. I kind of wanted to show you simpler how fast a person can move through this, and again, everybody does it at their own little pace and their own styles. This is just an example of some of the steps that you can start looking at doing and combining. So I have my equation here. It's quadratic because I have n squared, and so I can make my choice to use the quadratic formula, which means I have to move everything over. So that gives me n squared minus 9n plus 20. When you move them over, The signs just change, and they should go in this order. Even if things are kind of mixed up on one end or the other, when you move them back over here, you want to make sure they're in descending orders of your exponents and in standard form. So a equals 1, b equals -9, and c equals 20. So from there, I'm already kind of familiar with the quadratic formula. So I know I'm going to have a negative b, which makes that a +9, plus or minus the square of b, which -9 squared gives me 81, minus 4 times a, which is 4 times 20, which is 80, all over 2 times a, which is 1, which gives me 2. So x equals 9 plus or minus the square root of 1 over 2. X equals 9 plus or minus 1 over 2. Well, 9 plus 1 gives me 10 over 2, which is 5. 9 minus 1 gives me 8 over 2, which is 4. So x would equal either 5 or x equals 4. And I am finished with the quadratic formula. So obviously there's different ways that you can make it faster, easier, working in your brain order that you do it, but just want to kind of show you that once you practice and are familiar with it, how fast and basic the processes can go through. All right, I hope this helped.